So let's look at how we would run an EKG. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to attach electrodes in that thoracic region, okay? There's 6 electrodes placed in the thoracic region, 1 electrode placed on the anterior of each of your antebrachial regions, and 1 electrode placed at each of your tarsal regions. And so actually this might be the like antebrachial or carpal region, and then that'd be the tarsal region, okay? So reading an EKG can be very confusing, but it also is really beneficial. So a normal EKG is going to allow you to see that, and I'm going to go back to show you a normal EKG. Again, there's a normal EKG. Shows you the P wave, the QRS complex, and then the T wave. And so this all occurs within about 0.8 seconds, remember. So when you look at abnormalities in your EKGs or ECGs, that can tell you that something's going wrong. So here we see a 2nd-degree heart block. In this case, we have a partial block, and so some of the P waves are not being followed by the QRS complex. So you see a P wave, then a P wave, QRS complex, T wave. P wave, P wave, QRS complex, T wave. And so that is a problem. So your ventricles aren't contracting as normal. Here we have an atrial fibrillation. Our atria are contracting super fast, and so we have this really kind of squiggly line where the P wave should be, and then we have that QRS complex, and then squiggly line because the atria are just continuously contracting. And this can cause problems for individuals as well. If your atria are not contracting regularly, then you're not filling those ventricles up properly, and so when the ventricles contract, they're not going to be able to release as much fluid. In ventricular tachycardia, you see the QRS complex as very abnormal, and so you have so many of the QRS complex that the P wave is being covered up, as well as is the T wave. And so that can be a problem as well, because again, if your ventricles are contracting rapidly, then you're not able to fill those ventricles up as fast, and so that's not going to allow as much fluid to get into the blood vessels to get to the tissues. Ventricular fibrillation means that you don't have any normal electrical activity. So here is ventricular fibrillation, and in this case, the only treatment is to restart that heart. So you basically shock the heart to get it to start beating like normal. And then 3rd-degree heart block, there is no correlation between atrial and ventricular activity. So the atria are sending signals, but those signals aren't reaching the ventricles. And so there's no contact between the two. And this is a very serious condition as well. So this is a defibrillator. This is what we use to shock our heart when our heart is in ventricular fibrillation. This will help to reestablish the normal sinus rhythm of the heart. So let's look at what happens during a cardiac cycle. Cardiac cycle is all of the events that occur from one heartbeat to the next. And so there are 5 basic steps to the cardiac cycle. You have atrial systole, which is right here. This is when the atria have a high pressure put on them, and so they basically contract. Systole is contraction, and all of the blood that is still in the atria is pushed into the ventricles. This leads to a once that happens, the ventricles now have a higher pressure than the atria. And so the ventricles are going to be in such a high pressure that they start to expand, and those AV valves, tricuspid and bicuspid, are going to shut. This leads us to an isovolumetric contraction. So the blood's not moving anywhere, but it's increasing the pressure in the ventricles. The ventricles have to be at a higher pressure than the blood vessels. So contraction occurs due to differences in pressure. And if the ventricles are at a lower pressure than the blood vessels, then the ventricles are not going to be able to push the blood out into those vessels. So the ventricles increase the pressure through this isovolumetric contraction. And then we have ventricular systole, where the ventricles contract and push the blood out through those semilunar valves. So here we have isovolumetric contraction, ventricular systole, and these semilunar valves open, and the blood is ejected into these large arteries, either the pulmonary trunk leading to the right and left pulmonary artery, or the aorta leading to all of our system. Once that happens, the ventricles relax. The relaxation of the ventricles actually causes the blood that moves into the blood vessels to start moving back towards the ventricles. The blood vessels now are at a higher pressure than the ventricles. The moving of the blood back towards the ventricles actually closes those semilunar valves. So blood can't move back into the ventricles. The ventricles enter ventricular diastole, and blood starts moving in from the atria. So blood is pooling in the atria. Once that diastole occurs, then the tricuspid and bicuspid valve open, and we have ventricular filling during that diastole stage until, again, the atria contract. So the movements of blood occurs due to pressure differences, which is what I mentioned before. So as blood flows into the atria via the vena cava or the pulmonary veins, pressure in the atria rises, and this leads us to atrial systole. As blood flows from the atria into the ventricles, that causes the ventricular pressure to rise. That rise of pressure causes the AV valves to close, leading us to that isovolumetric contraction. The higher pressure in the ventricles then than the aorta or the pulmonary trunk leads to ventricular systole. And then as blood flows out of the ventricles, pressure in the ventricles drops, and we have a higher pressure in those blood vessels. Blood flows back towards the ventricles, and this closes those semilunar valves. So when we're listening with a stethoscope, we hear the heart beat. You hear this bum-bum, bum-bum, bum-bum. And it's typically thought of as a lub-dub sound. The lub occurs when the semilunar valves open. So that's that lub sound. The dub occurs when the semilunar valves close. That's that dub sound. And we use a stethoscope to hear the lub-dub sound. So we can place it in different regions around the heart. And when we do that, we can hear those valves open and close, and we can determine if there's any type of a problem with our different valves. So if you have a murmur, that could be a problem associated with a specific valve not opening or not closing all the way, or not being able to open properly. All right, I'm going to stop here, and in our last lecture, we'll talk about cardiac output and factors that influence cardiac output. I'll see you in the next lecture. Bye.